Hey friends, I'm Otis Gibbs, and this is David Torretta. He's going to talk about his friendship with the great Chuck Berry.
Actually, the first time I was a kid playing in a band with Billy Peak. I was 17, 18 years old. We used to play at this place called the Rainbow Lounge. And Chuck would come in there and sit in every once in a while because Billy played a lot like Chuck. And eventually, during that period, he was going to record his album Bio. And we ended up being the studio band on that. So that was a gas for a little kid. And we didn't get credit because they gave credit to the band that was touring with them. But I think eventually it got cleared up. But I was a little heartbroken when I didn't see my name on there. But that's where I first met him, got to know him. I actually knew his kids growing up because playing in bands, his one daughter, Melody, was dating a guy I was playing with at the time. So we kind of knew the family from that. Then several years went by. I moved out of town and came back. And actually I don't know if you remember when Mark McGuire was having his home run thing, the local radio station, KMOX, was running promo ads for every home run every night. And they needed a song to put behind it, and they asked me to write the tune. So I asked Chuck, I knew he was a big Cardinal fan, so if he wanted to be on it. So he came in the studio and we worked on it together and got along real well. And we just started working in the studio from then on. So like almost 20 years. We started out with 2-inch tape. We had recordings of everything, and he had a home studio when he spent some time in Ladue, this kind of uppity area, St. Louis. And unfortunately, the pinch roller on that thing was warped. So there was like, everything was wobbly on that. So we went to another studio and dumped all the tracks off and turned it into digital domain. And then we started working from there. And he's kind of a technical geek. So he saw Pro Tools for the first time. So, well, I want that. So he put one in at his house. So we started working there. And I had that set up here so we could kind of go back and forth. And we just noodled around with it for close to 20 years. And he'd have synthesizers and crazy stuff that he put on there that none of that actually made it to the end. And he was a real stickler on lyrics, which you could probably tell. But he'd come in and say, or change pronouns or, conjunctions. He just wanted to make sure the lyric was as clear and the intent as possible. So he'd be changing these to this or those and make sure the lyrics were understood the best and redo the whole vocal just because he wanted to change that around. What eventually became the album Chuck was started probably many, many years ago, 20 years ago plus. We started out recording in other studios, his home studio, commercial studio, back to his studio. And then we eventually ended up here and stripped away all the crazy stuff that was on there and replaced everything with his band that he was using here in town. Keith Robinson on drums, Bob Lohr on piano, Jim Marsalis on bass. His son, Charles Jr., played on it as well, and Ingrid. And we ended up finishing it all here. And it was fun.
In this room we're in right now?
This room right here.
Wow.
Yeah. And
did the neighbors see Chuck Berry walking in and out?
Yeah, they did. And he attracted a crowd when he came by. Yeah, he was pretty fearless about walking around in public. He would go to the casinos once in a while, and he was always real friendly with people that came up and asked him for autographs and stuff. And always had a joke. Chuck was most particular about lyrics and getting the idea of the song across. He really wasn't that concerned instrumentally, although he took his time with it and wanted to make sure his guitar parts were okay. And he was particular about what the bass is, and it was very different from the early Chuck records. You grew up and you heard like the Willie Dixon bass parts, and it was kind of walking, and there was that crazy thing with Johnny Johnson where it was playing shuffle against straight, but he kind of wanted a straight don't bass part. So you go for a Willie Dixon and he stops you. And goes, no, it's don't to match his guitar part. So I got a feeling he never cared for the early rhythm section that he was attributed for. Something might be in B or something. It's just, I think that came about because his hands are so big. Everything was a bar chord for him. And he never really paid attention to, despite some people's thoughts that it was a piano key or something like that. He just played it where he thought it sounded best on guitar. His hands were remarkable. They were so large. There was a given point when we were doing editing on it and a couple things were out of tune. And I thought, well, maybe we should just go in there and try to replace those notes. And realize you can't. You can't replace Chuck's hands. That was part of the sound because it almost makes him out of tune a little bit just because of the size of his hands. You just can't replicate that tone. It's all in the hands. A couple times it was funny when playing live, he'd break a string and maybe his son would hand him a Fender. And him playing a Strat was a joke because his hands just couldn't get that small. He had to have the biggest guitar, the Gibson. And
was he particular about gear?
Yeah, he only played like two guitars. One was a 345, and the other one was a stereo. I don't know the number on it, but
was he particular about amps?
Yeah. Well, part of it I think was from a business decision. His management company, William Morris, had a rider in his contract where he required a dual showman with reverb for every job. And the dual showman with reverb is a pretty rare duck. So most promoters would say, okay, we'll just get him a dual showman. Well, no. That'll cost you an extra $1,000 because you showed up with the wrong gear. And he just, he actually did like those Fenders. His settings were everything all the way up, everything on 10. Give me a Fender and everything on 10. At his home, we used a Twin once in a while. Yeah, and in another studio, we used a Princeton, or a Deluxe, actually. But his amp of choice was a dual showman. Not too much. I rarely saw his temper. He was pretty affable and funny when we were together. Everything was pretty light. Yeah, he had a funny way of approaching things. Most people's way of getting from A to B is kind of similar, and Chuck didn't get to A to B like other people. he had his own way. Like there was an instance, it could have been, temper raising, but it ended up being crazy. There's a situation with an engineer and an artist where you're going over a part, and sometimes the artist makes a mistake, and the engineer intuitively knows to stop the tape and go back. And so we were doing guitar solos one day, and I'd stop, and he'd start over again. And at one point, I stopped, and he thought it was a good take. And he went, "Gotcha." I said, "What?" He says, "That was a gotcha." I said, I wasn't quite sure what he meant. And I could tell he wasn't happy that I stopped recording, but he just said, "Gotcha." So later that day, we were going to have lunch, and we're driving down Brentwood Boulevard, and he pulls directly into oncoming traffic, just turns left. My hands go into the dashboard, and he jumps the curb, and we pull into this Chinese restaurant. And I'm just like frozen. And he turns to me and goes, "Gotcha." So he got his revenge. And I'm popping my fingers out of the dashboard. And yeah, he was a crazy driver. I figured one day he'd die from driving, but he made it. He had a few cars. He had a couple Cadillacs. He had a Mercedes, but most of the time he drove a Toyota Avalon, stay inconspicuous. And nobody expected Chuck to be driving around town in a Toyota Avalon. But he always have his captain's cap on. You knew it was him. Yeah, he was one of the few guys out of that generation that made money. I think Willie Dixon taught him a lot about business. And he didn't own the original masters, but after that he did. He learned this lesson, and like the early at Maybelline and stuff like that. I think there was like 2 other writers on credits, and he goes, "Who's this guy?" And well, he's helping you out. And who's this guy? I never met him. So after that, he insisted on sole authorship, and owned his publishing, and owned the songwriting, and owned the masters. But the early stuff he didn't. So he actually made a really good living out of his songwriting. Yeah, he made his royalties off of Johnny B. Good and everything, Roll Over Beethoven and all that stuff. He made royalties. He didn't own the masters on that, but he made the songwriting on that. Chuck was pretty humble, actually, about his talent. He just figured, he was doing the job, and he wrote songs. They sold. He was proud of that. Later in life, I think he was kind of proud of what he did, but he didn't hold himself in that high esteem in the big picture. One day I was at his house in Ladue, and in this house had all the photos of famous people on the wall, and all the gold records and stuff. And he saw me looking at it, and I saw one photo with him and Stevie Wonder and Ray Charles, and he came up and he says, all the people on this wall, there's only one genius there. And he pointed at Ray Charles. He says, that's the only real musical genius out of this whole bunch. And he didn't put himself in that league at all. And he just thought Ray Charles was the deal. He's not wrong. But yeah, he was pretty humble about his songwriting. And I'm just a guy doing it. But he knew that he inspired a lot of people. One more story about that on that wall. I was at his house and looking at all these photos and awards. And after a while, he says, "Let me show you what I'm really proud of." And he took me into his study, and he had all the diplomas that he achieved while he was in prison. And there was economics, there was a bunch of stuff, but he used his time well in prison, studied his ass off, and that's what he was most proud of.
Did people give him a hard time in prison, or did he talk about that?
I don't think he got a hard time in prison. He's a pretty imposing man. I wouldn't give him any trouble.
Chuck Berry he just seems like somebody I wouldn't want mad at me.
No, I wouldn't want him mad at me. He was strong, and strong till the day he died. He was in shape, just all muscle. All the while we were working on the Chuck album, he had management that would occasionally shop it around, and never with any luck. And so finally, we got so far with it, and I asked Chuck, I said, "Come on, we're just kind of messing around. Why don't you let me finish this up?" And he said, "Fine, let's do that." And so that's when we kind of replaced everything. We got the guys down here. We tightened it up really well. At that point, I have a friend, Tim Burnett, who's been in the business a long time as a manager. He started shopping it around and was getting really good results. A lot of people were interested in it. Unfortunately, a lawyer got involved late in Chuck's life. And I won't use any adjectives, but it was a lawyer. And at that point, everything kind of went south. And we were rushing to try to get the album out by his 88th birthday. In fact, it was originally going to be called 88. And then the lawyer got involved, and it got delayed. And I'm not sure of the motives, but they waited till Chuck passed away. And then it became Chuck. And Yeah, it was a little disappointing. I really wanted to get it out while he was still alive, and I was really proud of it.